I'm Alex,
I'm Robbie.
and this is Combat Thoughts.
We take a deeper look at the culture and philosophy behind martial arts. All right, so putting on a show versus winning a fight, because it's kind of a question about what the goal is in MMA fights. Because on one hand, in theory, the idea win the fight, you get more money, you advance up the rankings. However, I think for the UFC especially, and for organizations, their actual target is for you to put on a show. And long run, you may earn more money by putting on a show rather than winning fights, just in Gaethje, for example. So what's more important?
So I would say that it could sort of depend on where you are in the rankings and as you're going up the rankings. To me, it would make sense that when you're a champion, you try and go for the win rather than for the showmanship. And you see that, to be honest, across all successful champions, that tends to be the case. If you're going up the rankings, you will probably try and go for the finish, and you'll be more successful doing that as a fighter, in my opinion. At least that's kind of what the evidence seems to suggest, because you get yourself a name and you can get to the right level where you want to be. That being said, there are fighters who never get to a champion and are still good because, are still sought after as a fighter to watch because of their style.
Yeah, well, it might come back to what you just said. It will make you more successful as a fighter. And I think it kind of comes back again to what the point of fighting is. Because at the end of the day, these people are prize fighting. Their goal is to make as much money as quickly as possible. Putting on a show is a really good way to negotiate your salary up and to get a few win bonuses and to get that extra cash. But weirdly, it is not what's designed as the goal of each fight.
No, so I think the point about GSP and kind of John Jones become champions, before they was champions, the elbows that John Jones used to throw, spinning back elbows, all sorts of fancy stuff, real expression of himself, really fucking people up, was brilliant. But actually that then becomes the tipping point where your money is based on winning, and that's where the switch is. I think when you look at fighters who are not champions, you've got to look at the operating model of the UFC. And the way they operate is you need to get people interested. So it's in your best interest to basically put on a show. Cerrone is not a champion, is not the best in the world, puts a show on, kind of steps up, does the show, does the whole kind of, has a scrap, and will keep getting fights. You look at the way they treated John Fitch, and he was kind of lay and pray, really effective, really good fighter. I loved his style. It was brilliant. But it's not a casual's first style. And then the UFC doesn't take that forward. They're not interested in progressing that style because it doesn't help them make more money.
Yeah, well, what I find odd is how it can affect the sport, because it means that people might not fight in the most effective way possible. People might be more inclined to learn how to strike rather than learn how to grapple. Because quite frankly, the UFC does not know how to market a grappler.
Not really.
It's never been, it never gets done well. But
Yeah.
strikers get a few knockouts. That's exactly how you need to be marketed.
Yep.
I don't really like how it affects the integrity of the sport in that way. It's not just about the fighting anymore. It's about, does your fighting look pretty and does your fighting look impressive to people?
But
Now,
casual though.
Well, my example of that is if you look at arguably one of the best British fighters, you've got Nathaniel Wood fighting at Weekend, who's brilliant. Pre him breaking into the UFC, we had Brendan Loughnane from up in Manchester, and he's class. He's really, really good, and got the chance. He was on like an earlier tough, was really young, and then got a chance on the Contender Series. I think it was last year before,
Mm-hmm.
and he was winning the fight, smashed the guy for 2.5 rounds, and there's kind of a minute left in the round, and he clearly won. And he took him down and laid on top of him to make sure he won. Dana White was so pissed. He didn't give him a contract, was not interested. And he genuinely is one of the best UK MMA fighters. When those signals are being sent out from the guy at the top, you're going to really kind of have to adjust. Otherwise, it's really going to affect your career if you want to progress.
So I find it quite interesting how Kamaru Usman has managed to climb his way to the top in the way that he has, because he's always kind of been a fighter like that. He's always been a more strategic fighter and a more I don't really know how many finishes he has in the UFC, but it's not that many. A lot of his fights are decision won, and it's pure domination.
Fuck Colby.
Yeah, and it's not like he's in a shallow division either. He's in that division's pretty deep.
So
but then also he's a huge outlier in his technique, his skill. He's so much better than the people he's fighting, and he's winning in such dominant fashion. The UFC are probably not happy that he's the champion, but when you're that good, it's undeniable that you get to the top and get a title fight. I think he just made himself undeniably a contender because he was just fighting that way. I think if you're a middle of the road fighter and you want to make as much money as you can, there has to be a decision between, do you stand and bang a bit to make yourself a bit more exciting, or do you wrestle to win and probably get kicked out if you lose 2 in a row?
Yeah. You know what? I think it's almost quite sad, because if I were to get into MMA in a more professional sense, I'd get into it because I love the sport, not because I want to make money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to go into it and have to compromise how effective I am at the sport in order to make a living off of it. I would want to go in and be as effective as possible. But the state of the sport at the moment, it means that's almost not a very viable option. If you know you're not going to be an exciting fighter, it's almost not really a sport you want to get into, which already brings the level down, because as soon as you start kicking out people who are effective but boring, it brings the level of fighting down, and it's you're right there, Lee. It brings the level of fighting down, and it brings it just affects the integrity of the sport, and I just think it's quite a disappointing fact.
I think it's this is an interesting thing, because it's a bit of a contradiction, for example, from Dana White, because he always has talked about how he wanted MMA to become a sport. He did so much to make it a legitimate sport, and then really his marketing tactics are always pushed towards the non-sport part of it, which is just, let's get a fucking knockout in. So there's not that Dana White isn't a person who isn't known for his hypocrisy, but I think that is a problem. The issue is that the UFC wants to market towards the layperson, and as you say, then that compromises the ability of people to truly show true skill in the sport of mixed martial arts, which is across other martial arts.
That's difficult though, because from a purely kind of holistic perspective and kind of true martial artist, if you want to wrestle, that's how you express yourself in your martial arts, then that is how you fight, that's how you win. And that's what Robbie said, be the most effective you can be. The fact is, that's not what the UFC is. The UFC is a business, and you're joining a business that's trying to make money. They're not advertising to the likes of us, because we're gonna watch Damian Maia fight Ben Askren. If it was on the ground, we'd get excited about that. That's hard to sell to normal folk. What you can do is 30-second advert on ESPN and Ngannou knocking people out. Everybody responds to that.
Yeah, well, while I do still think it's a sad thing, and it's not a nice effect that it has on people who want to participate in the sport for the art, it's almost a necessary evil, because you can't rely on hardcore fans in order to drive the sport, because that's what Jiu-Jitsu does, and that's why Jiu-Jitsu is never going to be like, Jiu-Jitsu is just not good to watch for casual people. It needs to be advertised to the common, to the plebs, in order to in order to become a viable sport. Like, Dana's right. Like, Dana wants it to become a proper sport, and the way that he's done that is to improve the marketing by getting rid of those boring fights, those sort of no time limit matches, things like that. You can then sell it to people. So, though I think it's sad in terms of the effect it has on the sport and in terms of the artistic expression of people, it might be kind of necessary to get the funding and the recognition and the respect that the sport deserves.
I mean, look at Muay Thai in the US. I love Muay Thai. I love watching it. I've done it for years. But the number of knockouts in comparison to UFC is considerably less. And the US especially really struggle to market it, get people caring about it. And that is the point, is to be successful in it and to make a career of it, it has to be sold. And the market is, they like knockouts. I suppose the question you have to ask yourself if you're a fighter getting into the sport, getting into medium, high level competitions, is your fighting style there to make money and be marketable? If not, how willing are you to sacrifice that? And would you sacrifice that?
The question is, do you have to? Because there are some examples of fighters who were still able to get through, but as you said, that's like a middle of the road fighter. If you're someone like Kamaru Usman, who's, he's probably got some freak genetics, is very has been talented in a lot of sports that he's probably ever done. You probably don't get many of those people, so maybe you do have to sacrifice.
Well, the trouble is that the UFC can't purely be built on genetic freaks. You need people who, you need to support your common fighter, your middle of the road fighter, who pads out the fight card, who gives something to watch, and who is your future champion. You need to support them in order to, even if they've got a boring fight, they can't just get cut straight away, which is, potentially what will happen. If you're boring for a few fights in a row, you might just get cut. There's no protection in the contracts from that. You can't just use the few examples of people who have boring fights and still rise to the top as sort of an excuse for allowing only exciting fighters, just promoting exciting fighters with pay incentives and things like that.
So I'd go shout out to PFL here, because they have a more pure model in there. I know the season, I don't know the season too well, but I know the way it works is you get to the end. If you win the season, you win the tournament, you get $1 million. If you're the best, you win the money and you don't have to sacrifice. Now, there's extra ways of making money off the back, and if you're more exciting, more marketable, I'm sure you make more money in the long term. But is that not a good model then to say, actually, if you want to show your martial arts in the cage, in the way it's meant to be, in the most effective way you can deliver that, PFL's model is probably a lot better suited to you rather than the marketing machine that is the UFC?
Didn't
True, but
Rory McDonald move on to PFL now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question then would be, is that sustainable for the sport as a whole? How many people are in those PFL tournaments?
Oh, God knows. I could check, but yeah, I had no idea.
Well, it's not going to be, how many people it's not going to be the UFC roster of people, right?
No.
Right. It's going to be like a 16-man tournament that takes place over like a year.
Yep.
It's going to be something like that. I think that's a really interesting aspect to the sport. I think it's a really good way to improve the sport and provide an alternative platform. I don't think it's a viable way to build the sport as a whole.
But the PFL are not trying to build the sport. They're saying, we're going to take a roster of 16 who's out there established and put them to the test, see who's the best. Coming at it from an established fighter perspective, you kind of middle of the card, 15 ranked in the UFC, get cut because you've had a few boring fights, say. I think that's a safe haven for not sacrificing your style.
Okay, yeah, fair enough, but I think the trouble then is you need to have flexibility in the contracts, because it kind of comes back to our last podcast that the three of us did. Basically, the fact that you can't go to a different organization to compete. Those people that PFL get are only the ones that get cut or hit the end of their contract each time. I think if you're going to I think PFL is interesting, but I think for it to really flourish and for it to really provide a safe haven for people to do that, it needs to be able to draw on all fighters. There needs to be a way for people to go over from the UFC to PFL to compete in that aspect, because people get tied into the UFC for 5-10 fights at a time. They're not going to be able to go and express themselves in PFL next time it rolls around.
But then if you're in the UFC and you've got 3-4 fights left, you fight them out, you've got a winning record, you're pretty good. I think PFL now is that's where the way they are getting some bigger names. Like you said, you got Rory McDonald now. It's a huge name. Like it's becoming they're not trying to build the sport from scratch, and as that gets more and more recognized, as the funding's there to give people $1 million, you're going to get people who are going to back themselves and say, do you know what, the UFC don't like the way I fight, the UFC don't promote me as they should or could. I'm going to try that. I'm not saying it's the perfect answer, but it's better than what we had 5-10 years ago, when I've started rewatching some of the old toughs of an evening to kind of put me to sleep, and some of them are terrible. But I was watching an episode last night, and Dana White goes into the house and starts shouting at the people like a school teacher, saying, these fights have been dog shit. I need knockouts. I need people being sparked out.
Yeah.
Don't think you're getting a contract if you're on the show. You need to start upping your game. It's kind of, in a world like that, you've been forced to change your style. Yeah. At least now there's some choice.
That's true. I mean, in that case, do you think it would be good if people could express themselves in any way? Or do you think imagine we brought in the Ali Act in MMA, and there was some way to say, look, if you win these fights, you will climb the ranking and you will become the mandatory challenger, and you may become the face of the UFC as their champion.
Yep.
Do you think that would be good or bad for the sport as a whole? Because it would allow people to express themselves better. But, the UFC puts these people forwards and markets these people specifically because they're exciting.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be good?
I don't even know if it would be good. I wanted to say maybe it would be good for the fighters because they would have more freedom. But then I'm thinking, would that suffer in financial sense? Because you would have, but then see, I don't know, because like if you're on a pay-per-view card, you're on the main card, you're not going to be getting the pay-per-view money anyway. It's mostly going to be from everything else that the UFC does. So maybe it would be better.
That's the point, is the Ali Act gives a kind of better distribution of money, or more equal distribution of money across the spectrum of fights. And like you said, if you beat this person, you get paid this much, you become mandatory challengers and so on. I think what happens then, though, is you're only ever going to be paid the money that they generate. And if then you develop the next wave of fighters who are playing it safe, wrestling, eyes are quickly going to go off it, actually that pot of money that you're getting a distribution of gets less. So there's a fine balance between the two, I think. And not to go back to the podcast last time, I think we could do 12 podcasts about fight to pay, if I'm honest, because it comes from all different angles. But actually, it's kind of, to keep it as a career and to have a sport, you need that pot of money to be distributed to the fighters, and being exciting is a big part of that. I think to flip this, we've looked at this a lot from the person coming up. I think there's we started from the kind of top down of once you get to the top, is the incentive so large to not be exciting and just win that actually our champions get fairly boring because they have to keep the belt. Once you get those pay-per-view points, you realize that actually holding somebody against the cage for a round and winning 10-9 isn't too bad. And do you know what? That spinning elbow probably shouldn't happen here. Are we ruining it at the top?
Well, if you look at someone like John Jones, he's still someone that's really, he's an exciting person, but maybe that's not because of the fact that he's been a champion for so long, but because of all the shit that he's done in his life.
So I think his fighting style is completely different. He is now, for me, the best defensive fighter in the UFC. His distance management is brilliant. He does just enough to win rounds. You look at his fight with Brandon Vera. He opened up the fight with Shogun Rua with a flying knee. When was the last time you see him do something like that? When was the last time he threw a really heavy spinning elbow or kind of threw caution to the wind? Yeah. The way he fights now is the end of his reach. He's got a good jab. He's got those oblique kicks to keep you away. He scores enough points to win rounds and win fights. I think it's made him, and I think John Jones is brilliant, but I think it's completely changed his style to the point where he's now just wins to kind of keep his statue at the top.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think the good fix for that would be? Would it be to make their position more risky, because then they have to stay exciting to sort of stay in place and stay the champion? Or do you think it would be to make it less risky, because at the moment the reason they're taking low risks is they want to stay the champion, they want to keep that money. If there was a bit of a safety net there in whatever way there could be, maybe people will feel more free to open up about their techniques and how they perform. Like, do you need a sort of carrot or a stick to get people?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. Because at the minute, I think we have both, depending where you are. I think at the top, the problem at the top is that dropping from the champion to a normal ranked fighter, that pay-per-view point drop is so large that it basically forces you into just win fights.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, if there was that safety net, if there was something written into contracts where as the champion for the next, 3 fights after you lose your belt, you still get pay-per-view points, you'd probably still see a few more exciting fights.
That's a good shout. A few extra fights where you always get pay-per-view. And though I hate it in some ways, the mandatory rematches that boxing always writes in.
Yeah, I completely disagree with those.
I do in principle, but they might fix this particular problem.
Yeah, and I think that's great, but then I also think, I thought Usman Masvidal, if say Masvidal was the champion and got beat by Usman, I don't need to see that again.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for, and the UFC isn't always right, but Max and Volkanovski was really close. I see why you run that back, and I'd probably like them to run it back again. But then when the fight's so Figueiredo and Benavidez, I'm good. I never need to see that again. Mandatory challengers are just it makes it painful.
That's fair. I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's never going to be a perfect system.
No.
And it's always going to require a little bit of tweaking to get it right. But the one thing I think that can save boring fighters, weirdly, is like trash talking and stuff behind the fights, because that way you can put in some theatrics and you can make a show.
Ben Askren.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, without compromising your fighting ability whatsoever.
Yep. Yeah. You go so far the other way on the marketing side of it, the being people know who you are. Colby Covington doesn't have the most exciting style, and he gets he gets a lot of eyes watching him, mostly to see him get beat, but he gets the eyes on him. One of my favorite fighters is Poirier, and he's coming from a completely different side. He's really quiet, really kind of not out there.
Yeah, but just has an exciting style.
Yeah. So I think that's probably where your comparison is best. If you're the wrestler, the not knocking people out, struggle to get a highlight video, maybe look at the Ben Askren approach. If you let your fighting speak for itself and you're knocking people out, you're really exciting. The Poirier approach can work for you just as well, but it's taken him a long time to get to the top.
All right. So the answer is, if you're a grappler in the UFC, start talking some shit.
Yeah. And if you're knocking
Perfect.
people out, you can keep quiet. And if you want to get to the top really quick, copy Sean O'Malley.